All right, folks, welcome back to Inside the Numbers on Tuesday, April 7th, right? Yeah, April 7th. So Tim will be joining us shortly when he gets a couple of things figured out and worked out, and he'll bring us the market update. But for now, I think I'm just going to kick right in with the modeling because that is the real, I guess, the big news of the day, right? So the bottom line here, folks, is that this idea, and I'm just going to jump into stuff today. The idea that social distancing is the reason why some of these models have been revised down, I have to address this morning, because social distancing was never really it was never really possible to measure to begin with. And now we see these significant revisions downward to these models as we go forward. And when they update them, they do their best to explain we have more data, better data, and that's why we're seeing some of these revisions. But in truth, we keep hearing that old slogan: the models are only as good as the data you put into them. But that's not entirely true. It is, but it's not alone true. Models are only as good as the data you put into them, and they're only as good as the assumptions that you make when you put them together. And I think some of these models, there are a few things wrong. So first, we're looking at the early data out of China, which is where a lot of this stuff was predicated on. And there's a number of problems with that. One, they lie. The Chinese government's not trustworthy. And number two, testing was not quality testing. It was faulty. We spoke about this the other day in the show. That's why the CDC does have the rules and restrictions that they have. The U.S. has to develop its own test. And honestly, not all government regulations are good, but these seem to make sense. But again, it's easy to claim that social distancing is working and working better than expected, and that's the reason. And of course, the incentive there is for officials to say that because of the drastic or draconian choices that they made for mitigation efforts, and that the impact and the damage they've had on the economy, which we're going to talk about with polling in a little bit, how people are starting to feel about that, and the government's response, which was it was almost inevitable. In the end, people will care more about their pocketbooks. But the modeling, Fauci, the rest of them, that made headlines, 100 to 240,000. God willing, it not only looks like we could not hit that, but we could come significantly lower. And some people seem to be upset about this, which is mind-boggling. There's almost nothing we don't politicize anymore. But everybody should be happy that they were wrong. But hopefully we learn from this and go forward with what they have to be taken with a grain of salt. Not all modeling is going to be wrong all the time. But the way I liken this is when we model elections, this reminds me to make a comparable, to use a comparison. This is like us modeling elections and using polling we know is not right, using historical data that is inaccurate, even though we would have that. These modelers, to their credit, they don't have that. They're making up some of these assumptions, or they're doing their best to estimate this stuff. But that's like us using polling we know is wrong, historical data that we either got wrong or is just incorrect, plugging that into the model, and then expecting we're going to be able to predict the outcome of an election correctly. And here we are now. So while I'm happy, I think it's important moving forward. These modelers, they work hard. It's not easy, trust me. And I'm a freehand guy still. I'm old school. I'm freehand. I would not even love doing something. I enjoy modeling elections. Modeling something like this is not my wheelhouse. But God forbid anybody ever asked me to do that, because that's tough. Your reputation's on the line, and you try and you do the best you can. But leaders, it's their role to balance some of this and to take these models and make such draconian decisions, these draconian policies out of them. I just hope we learn from this. I really do. We'll circle back to that, but we always do the market update, right? So Tim, he's doing what he's doing right now, and he'll join us soon. So I'm going to do it for us. So we're looking like we're going to have a second, I'll do my best because I can't replace Tim, but it looks like we're going to have a second good day. The futures showed that the Dow, was up between 3 and 4%. That would be around 10 or 11% on the week. In the S&P, that's up about 3% right now. We're at 2732. The Dow's about 23,422. So, another day of rallies. And the reason, again, I got to get into this because I keep hearing on big media and we see these headlines, a second round of stimulus, which will help me segue into the polling here. A second round of stimulus is not what the market is looking at. That the market, every time Donald Trump goes to the microphone and discusses maybe we'll open sooner rather than later, that's when we see these market rallies. Stimulus, while important to the markets, and again, I'd really rather Tim, get into this because liquidity does matter, and of course, traders are going to be looking at that. But in the end, this is really about getting the economy open again. And every time Trump comes out on a positive note and he talks about getting this economy open again, we see these rallies. I was never, like I said yesterday, I was never worried about the markets rallying back, folks. Markets come back. When I used to be in that business, I used to have this big chart on the wall behind my desk for clients to look at. And it was a chart of whether you just took $1,000 and put it in the markets before the Great Depression. And you just let it rot and you didn't touch it. You didn't panic and sell when we had downturns and crisis. You just left it alone. And it was a great illustration of what would happen with your money if you did that. So I am not a seller. These are buying opportunities for people, who have been in the markets, for a while. But I'm worried. I have been all along worried about the real economy. And now we're seeing Americans are getting concerned too. So I want to talk about this Rasmussen poll that came out this morning, because while we have seen a modest increase in Trump's approval rating, the danger here is that people care about their pocketbooks. They care about that first. That's first and foremost to them. They know if their financial situation is not stable, it leads to a host of other problems, which has been the argument all along. The cost of an economic shutdown is almost immeasurable. So before we, talk about these months-long shutdown to the economy, it's almost immeasurable. But that's not the point of this segment right here. The whole idea was to segue into this poll. I saw this come out this morning. I look at Rasmussen every day, and they got, the reason why is they got headline questions, and I love headline questions. So in any event, looks like a quarter of American adults now think the U.S. government can buy their way out of the negative economic impact that's resulting from the coronavirus, and that, due to stimulus. And we're hearing Congress now talk about another round of stimulus. This one's not even done yet. And with the modeling wrong, maybe it's a little bit premature to talk about spending trillions and trillions of other dollars we don't have. And I'm for a Republican administration, Democrats would love nothing more than to see them spend trillions and trillions of dollars, which, let's face it, the Trump administration is not a fiscally, his priorities have not been the national debt, but now the priorities for the voter and the average American is getting worried about this. 45% disagree that, which isn't a majority, but we're only talking about a quarter who think that the government can spend their way out of this or mitigate the economic damage with more stimulus money. So 45% disagree, and 54%, which is a majority, it's a solid majority, worry that the government will run out of money if the U.S. Congress continues down this road. Think about that for a second. The government, nobody has cared about the debt for all these years. It was a Republican talking point under the Obama administration, and then of course we heard Democrats bring that up during the tax reform bill, but they didn't really care about this. And now here we are, and they're going to lob this onto this administration, and people are listening. That's my point. People are listening. About a third, or 3 in 10, 30%, are undecided on this question. And I want to read how this question is worded, because the wording is everything on a survey. We should talk about that one day. Survey design and wording and the impact that it will have on political polls, or opinion polls in general. We should talk about that. So let me look at how this question is worded. I think I heard Tim beep in, but give me a second. Let me read this out to you guys. Can the United States buy its way out of the economic damage done by the coronavirus crisis with government money? And again, I just read you the results. The question, the answer, and it's the party, while party is still the greatest indicator of how somebody's going to answer, it's pretty interesting how across the board this is. So while the president enjoys widespread support among his own party and his base, the fact of the matter is even his own party doesn't believe that this is a viable path. So in any event, we all know on March 23rd, he signed the CARES Act, $2 trillion over 2.2, but now they're talking about another round. And the president wants $2 trillion in infrastructure. That's a whole other debate. But on the question of whether adults, because it's of American adults, on the question of whether they are concerned about running out of money, 23% are very concerned, but a sizable minority, 42%, don't share that concern. I would fully expect that to go down, including 18%, by the way, who are not at all concerned. So, you know, the intensity there of feelings is really not high now. But when people start to feel more of this economic impact, I would strongly suggest that that changes. And again, interesting, really most interesting, Republicans are about at 30%. They're only slightly more likely than Democrats at 26%, and unaffiliated much more likely, about 20%, to think that America can buy its way out of the current economic problems that have come from the coronavirus. So again, Democrats are less worried to that question, but they are just as skeptical as to whether or not this is even really going to do its job. Let me peek in here and see if we got Tim yet. We got Tim. Can you hear? Oh, I suppose not. All right. So in any event, while we're talking about this other round here, the 300 plus billion in stimulus money for small businesses from the PPA loans, that hasn't even been distributed yet. And we're talking about another round. And these numbers, you know, Trump had a bump. He had a rally around the flag kind of effect where his approval rating went up. But the longer this goes on, the more dangers you're going to see here for him, for his reelection. And you're going to see people start to question, you know, whether or not the right moves were made during times of crisis. And this is what, you know, Tim and I have been talking about for 3 days now. Crisis is the worst time to make a rash decision. Sometimes you have no choice but to act quickly, but it's the absolute wrong time to make quick, rash decisions. And, you know, like we've been saying, crisis is the father of bad decisions. So I see Tim in the queue. Let me see if I can pop him in. I don't know if he's got his audio up yet, but let me see. Can you hear Tim? You with us? No, he can't. All right. So let's move on until he figures out whatever is going on over there. But again, I just you know, we're looking today, and the reason why I read that right after the modeling is put aside the economic impact. Consider the downward revisions to these models, significant downward revisions, and the money that we've spent. And, you know, in the future, we'll debate whether or not that was wise. And I'm a small business owner, and I've read a lot of your comments, which is why Tim and I have followed this PPA story on how this program was doing. But at the same time, we're already now talking about moving forward with another round. And we haven't even ironed out the kinks, and we haven't given these models a chance to get situated. You know, to iron the entire idea here was to flatten the curve. Before we go spend another couple $1 trillion, shouldn't we hang out for maybe, you know, 7 to 10 days, see if this thing starts to mitigate? And everybody, I mean, it's going to be their natural instinct to want to, you know, to want to cite social distancing for for the model being wrong, these models being wrong, specifically the one that the White House uses. You know, we hear a lot about the Imperial College model. I think that spooked the administration a little bit. Why wouldn't it? I mean, but that's not the model they use. We showed you that yesterday. You know, and it's just, we were actually supposed to be expecting a jump of about 1,200 today in the death count. So we'll see when it gets updated. Our what we look at may not be. It may lag a little bit, maybe by a half a day, but we know it's accurate. So we'd rather look at that. We know what we were told to expect, and we will see these bobs up and down. We're not, by far, we're not seeing. We can't conclusively say right now that this is a trend. We flatten the curve and we're moving up. We can't say that. I mean, we looked at Spain, we looked at Italy. In other instances, we saw these countries look like they were getting ready to flatten the curve. And, like I said yesterday, it's like a bobber when you're fishing. They bounce up and down. And and unfortunately, huge Fauci's, they took their foot off the gas too early. So, we'll remain hopeful, but still, we're not expecting the numbers that we were initially told, which was 100,000 to 240,000 with mitigation efforts. And again, it's so difficult for them to be able, to cite these social distancing if that was the number with mitigation efforts. So we have to keep this in mind. These numbers were when everybody was locked up, when the economy was shut down. That were those projections. Without mitigation efforts and without social distancing, we were talking about a lot more. We were talking about millions of people. And it just doesn't look, maybe it's a testament to the American healthcare system, American medicine, we just, again, we didn't have to send back tests that weren't working. That was not a problem for us in this country. While the testing took a little bit to get off the ground, that was not an issue for us. So, it's maybe, again, a testament to American medicine. I'm not trying to throw everything on the modelers here by any means, but I am saying that again, crisis is the most important time to weigh all options and to be thoughtful and considerate about what we do. We have now, and if you've been listening, Tim and I have told you, the jobless claims numbers are not done rising. The jobs reports that the last one we just saw, 701,000 jobs lost, that's nothing compared to what we're going to see. That's not to be a negative Nancy here. I'm just trying to explain, decisions have consequences. I just hope, I'm telling you, I just hope we learn from this. Modelers, I don't know what it is. It's like something maybe it's the internet that, we have election model fads. We have all these other fads, with modeling. And now it's not just like a fun thing for people who like polls and elections and to track, it wasn't my idea of a good time to look up CDC burden estimates and model them out until this happened. This is new, but this is how we are now as a society. This is how we digest news and current events. And now, if we're going to be taking these models seriously, then I really would like to see us learn and be a little bit more considerate before we make these decisions. And I know some people are going to say, that's because we did listen. That's because we were social distancing. We can't really prove that. Not yet. And anybody who tells you otherwise is either lying to you or they're full of it. They don't know what they're talking about. Officials know. They may go out there to the microphone and say it because that's what they believe. They believe that. But they cannot prove that to you. Not yet. And maybe it turns out that's the case. And I want to make that clear. Maybe it turns out that is ultimately the case. Social distancing was it. That's it. But we don't know that now. Without antibodies testing, widespread antibodies testing, without a host of other data that we have not gotten yet, we will not know this. Not for sure. And yeah, these events, they come at you fast. So it's not like, policymakers have a whole lot of time to react. But now that we are seeing these numbers do what they're doing, and, on a positive note, this administration has completely rebuilt the apparatus for how we handle these pandemics, these epidemics. And moving forward, this will be a lot easier for the next guy or girl who's, or next man or woman who turns out to be the chief executive. And again, by no means talk about this yesterday, but and I did see a lot of comments about that. I probably will get into this more today with the governors. He's an easy guy to scapegoat. Donald Trump is a very easy guy to scapegoat. But the fact of the matter is that governors are just, they weren't ready. I'm a little bit, and I've been good with Andrew Cuomo, and I think that in the moment, he's done a pretty decent job of trying to handle this, parting aside his attempts to cast blame on the president. But at the same time, I cannot believe New York City, my beloved New York City, the number one terror attack target in the world, not just the country, in the world, was not prepared for a widespread pandemic during flu season, which again happens to be a pretty bad flu season, which is something that we did kind of expect that this year. I know that, well, not we, meaning me and everybody, medical professionals did expect maybe, potentially a bad flu season. And that is definitely not helping the situation. Just media, they like I've said a bunch of times, they tend to oversimplify things. They tend to oversimplify problems, and they don't, it's just not their model. It's not their business model to get granular, to steal Dr. Birx's word, about these issues. They're not going to sit there and explain to you that hospitalizations and the need for beds, this many is for the coronavirus, this many is because of flu season, and we have these independent cases of pneumonia. They're just not going to do that. Don't expect them to, because it's not their business model. It's not in their interest. They like these, they don't like the situation. They like the headlines. This is what they do. This is what media is for. I see Tim. Let me try to pop him in, guys. Bear with me a second.
I'm here.
Can you hear me? You can hear me. All right. So I guess I did something a little bit different today. That might have been on me, Tim. Honestly, maybe you had been there.
I think it was, but don't tell anybody.
Whoops. We just told everybody. I was going on this tangent because I'm just, and I'm not trying to cast any kind of blame here, because this was a completely new situation. But what I was saying is that I hope we learn from this with the importance of models. I hope we learn that that models cannot be taken as gospel. That's the way I'm trying. That's really, I wish I would have came up with that 22 minutes ago. That was ultimately my point from the beginning. Even as somebody who models elections, this is the different animal, but you can't take models as gospel. Media shouldn't take election models as gospel. And policymakers should not take healthcare projections as gospel, especially when the underlying data that they built these models on, Tim, was never sound to begin with. It was never sound. It was a combination of China lying, China not having accurate, trustworthy testing results, and that was the standard for these models. And what's driving me nuts now, which I already have, but I'll give you a chance to comment on it before, I don't know, maybe we'll do the market thing after the little word from the sponsor spiel. But, my entire point was that models are not only, and we hear this saying all the time, that models are only as good as the data you put into them. That's not only true. Models are only as good as the data you put into them and the assumptions that you make when you design them. And the assumptions, somebody needs to explain how on earth they're trying to gauge social distancing. Because I know I've asked them, to explain this to me. This is all out of early, behavior with China and the policies that China did and how they were able to flatten their curve after, enabling these policies. But the truth of the matter is, Tim, nobody believes the Chinese data with good reason. I'm stunned that media reports it the way they do, but nobody believes it with good reason. But these models were built on data that is unreliable, knowingly unreliable. And the assumptions that were made based on reports you can't believe. And that is like the equivalent of me plugging in polls I know are not accurate, looking up historical election data, and deciding I want to put in my own election data because I don't like what it says. I don't like what it says about the 2008, 2012 elections.
So I'm just going to make up what happened in 2012, or I'm going to make my own best guess estimate. I'm going to, this is ridiculous. This is crazy. Go ahead.
What about the South Korean data?
Right. But that's a good point. That's a really good question. If you have the slight modeling is such an animal where you can make like the smallest correction could make all of the difference. And South Korea was not as big of a case. So modeling is obviously going to wait.
They had a very, very, very large outbreak connected with that one
Right.
church. And that's probably what drove 80% of their cases.
And been the total that actually would make it worse too, Tim, because they don't have a wider, in the case of China, in the case here, we have very different reasons for why people contracted the virus in Washington state, as opposed to why people contracted the virus in New York and in Florida. In the early days down here, it was almost all attributable to people who had just returned from flights. Very different. And South Korea compared with other early data, which came from China, a model is naturally going to weight the importance of these scenarios. And, you just have this unreliable, outsized data set impacting these models and a variable that is basically unmeasurable. You cannot measure social distancing. You can't. You just can't. Not yet. You just can't.
Well, that may be true, but I don't think that anyone is really going to argue the case aggressively that social distancing has been a non-event toward flattening the curve.
Right. Well, but the question is, how much of an impact did it have? That's the question.
Well, you're never gonna know that. You're never gonna know that for sure.
And my entire point is, if let's say we end up, let me look right now, and we were talking about this a little bit.
I don't think anybody ever gave legitimacy to the original models that said we could have 1 million deaths here
without social distancing. And that, that's the point I was trying to stress early when I opened this up. That's the entire point I was trying to stress. You can, again, this was done. These estimates were given, those 1 million death counts, that was given without mitigation efforts. And the 100,000 to 240,000 number that the White House eventually had settled on, that came with mitigation efforts. And my point is, right now, look at the model that the White House uses right now. They are at about 81,000 and change. Still a horrible number, of course. Right. Still a horrible number, of course.
Yeah.
Some of the, and look, and we've talked about this, coronavirus is not the flu. And I don't like it when people compare it to the flu, because it's much more contagious and it's much more dangerous for a certain segment of the population.
Right.
And nobody is a statistic.
So why are the numbers in California so much less than other big population parts of the country? That's
a good idea. And I don't think we know that for certain yet.
They went on the campaign of minimal community contact very early.
But there are, Gavin Newsom too. He had a bit of a head start on this. I mean, he got a little bit of a jump. It did go. California was one of the earlier times, and the one
they had some early breakout cases in the San Francisco area, and in a town allegedly a person between San Francisco Bay Area and Sacramento. Vera, California, I believe, had no contact with anyone. Clearly, she had, but they couldn't.
Right. Remember that
they couldn't identify what contact she'd had.
Yeah.
I think we were in DC that weekend when that story broke.
We were,
and then they went down on a hard clampdown in the Bay Area, and they went to the clampdown a week before the White House guidelines, I think, throughout the state.
Right, and you again that does support
And their
it.
numbers are very
But
low.
there's also there's a lot of other factors here, Tim. Population density is another. Look at New York and New Jersey. Actually, we talk about New York City a lot because it's the epicenter, the most per square mile, the most dense state in the country is New Jersey
Right.
for population per So there's a lot of things that we're going to have to look at and dissect when we do the autopsy on this thing. But my point is, okay, if we come in, and I know some people are actually optimistic, we're not even going to come near that. We're not even going to hit that 81,000. I hope that's to be the case. I do. But my entire argument is here, until we get, there is a completely unknown element out here, Tim. Until we get antibodies testing, we have no idea. We just don't. And, my point is sometimes
we can't quantify.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
But what about
we can quantify the jobless claims, though?
What about the extremely large breakouts in New Orleans and Louisiana? You know that is the direct result of Mardi Gras.
Yeah, I mean Mardi Gras, and those are cases to make for social distancing. It is, but there are, I don't like the Sweden comparison. It's a completely different kind of country. I don't like when people compare universal health care from European nations incorrectly.
There's 5 million people in the whole country of Sweden. It's
That's
not
right.
a good
And a lot of them work from
comparison.
home. A lot of them work from home.
Right.
It's a completely different culture. And again, Italy is probably a good, it will turn out to be a good data set when you're in support of social distancing because of culture. Man, I'm Italian. Try to tell Italians to stay away from each other and not hug each other. There's a lot of people that compare that country to Sweden. How many people average number of people live in a single household.
What percentage of the outbreaks in New Jersey are as a result of that family that you and I were talking about the other day? That the media made a big deal about 3 people in the family had died.
They're a well-known family in Jersey.
Right.
Well known in a lot of people might not
and they
realize
completely ignored everything involved with the coronavirus and the implications of people that are sick just freely congregating with other people.
Right. Let me do a little spiel here, and then when we come back, because we can stay on these models all day, but when we come back, I did a quick little market spin. You take that away when we come back. All right. That's
okay.
That's your wheelhouse. I basically, the Dow's up here it is. But you get into it a lot more. And I was making the point that the markets really don't care about stimulus money at this point. They want to reopen the economy. So here we go. So it's about 10:33. So again, we're going to do this today. We blasted this out everywhere. We were just doing this on YouTube and on PPD the last couple of days, but now we went out everywhere. I could see there's some people on Scope looking at it. I didn't announce it and tell people we were going to do it, but this week we'll put it on Facebook Live and we'll put it on Periscope. Again, when we get back to the grind, people need information. When we get back to the grind, we'll go back to how this was supposed to be. And then Fridays on YouTube, and maybe we'll keep doing it on Facebook Live, Tim, on YouTube and the other venues. But anyway, if you want to support the show, just subscribe to PPD. Go to ppdnews.us/subscribe. And that's the quick word from the sponsor, because we didn't have Tim in the first quarter of the show, and I really want him to get you guys this market update. I'll be right back, Tim. Take it away.
Okay, so the markets started out the day on a very positive note. Futures were up strong overnight. In the first half hour of trading, we were up a little over 3%. We've given up some of those gains right now. And the market averages are up between 2 and 2.5%. The Dow's up about 500 points. S&P is up maybe about 35 points, maybe a little bit more. And I think what's really constructive for the market today is just if we hold on to some of these gains by the close. I think that it would not be unexpected at all if we had some selling into this rally. It's a very strong move for the second consecutive day. Although I will say the breadth in yesterday's market, and that a lot of people would talk about the internals, were very strong. You had a 10-to-1 advanced decline numbers, meaning that we had 2,700 issues advancing and less than 300 issues declining. Those are very, very high numbers. You only get that usually when you're coming off a very oversold market condition. And clearly we had that during the lows of March 18 to March 23. We also had a 90% up volume day yesterday, meaning that of all the total volume in the market yesterday, 90% of that volume was to the upside. So for us to be giving up the early gains from the first half hour doesn't really bother me at all. I really like to see like where we are at 2 o'clock and then how we finish the day. And you know, we're the market now is it's trying to see if this move off the lows from March 18 to March 23 is a legitimate base for the market to build off of and consolidate, going sideways with a little bit of an upward bias until we can get hard guidance on when we're going to start opening back up the economy, and it will very likely be in stages.
Right. Well, I didn't look at the volume, but there could be some, good old fashioned profit taking right now too. So, we had a nice run, but it is important. It would be nice to see a second day of significant gains. I don't know. I don't want to. I mean,
my initial gut reaction was before it was clear that the futures were going to be so strong coming into the opening. I just felt very, very early that if we can just keep 2/3 to 3/4 of yesterday's gains, that would be very positive.
Right.
Now, given the fact that we opened up 3% higher, the Dow was up 900 points at its peak. We had similar moves for the S&P and NASDAQ. It would be a little disappointing to give all of those back and end up negative. But I think it'll be important what the market does in the last 90 minutes of the day. And the reason I'd be fine with being down 1%, 1.5% after being up over 5% yesterday, that we had a very, very sharply higher move just in the last 10 minutes of the day yesterday. The market added an additional 1.5%. So I could see us giving that back and keeping 3/4 of yesterday's gains, and then just using that as a little bit of a buffer for the rest of the week. And of course, the market's closed on Friday, so we're talking a 4-day week.
We're far off the Ackman lows, I mean, guys, the market's it's Good Friday on Friday. The markets are closed. The builders aren't working on the house. A lot of people will be home.
From yesterday's close, the S&P had rallied 17% off its low, closing a low on March 23rd.
Can you explain what we mean by Ackman lows?
Sure.
Because we're going to say this a lot. It's a wise guy term, actually, folks. But go ahead. It's derogatory.
When I say that the market put in lows from March 18 to March 23, March 18 was a Wednesday. The market had been very weak, making new lows for a couple days. This guy, Bill Ackman, who's a big name fund manager, kind of has the reputation of being an activist manager, which means he'll take positions in companies and then call up management and say, I own like 3 or 4% of your stock. I'm thinking about expanding my position. I think you guys have got a lot of potential, but there's some things you're doing that I think are really misguided, and basically trying to either put his own designated people on the board of directors and or get the company to make some significant changes of what they're doing. So he goes on one of the big financial news networks, CNBC, during the lunch hour and goes into about a 15-minute rant of how basically his view was we really need to shut the government down for at least 30 days, have absolutely no activity anywhere, halt all airline travel, halt all rail travel, halt people from going out of their house unless it's to pick up the newspaper on their front porch, and an extreme hardcore shutdown. And then it just degenerated from that point into a very emotional rant about how he hopes his 80-year-old mother doesn't die, and hell is coming. This is going to get a lot worse than before it gets better. The market at that point in time went from down about 700 points. It went down until about 1 o'clock. It hit level 1 circuit breakers where the S&P was down 7%. Reopened 15 minutes later, very jittery, eventually rallied, got about half of those losses back toward the end of the day. And I felt at that point in time, and I wrote about it the following day, was that people are going to talk for months and years and maybe decades that these were the Ackman lows. Okay, because it was created by a guy who's got a fairly wide reputational following among investors. He's a known kind of a media talking head on occasion, had a very highly publicized fight with Carl Icahn over the Herbalife story. Now it's probably 7 or 8 years ago. Carl Icahn won that fight pretty convincingly. He thought Herbalife was a Ponzi scheme, pushed the SEC and the Federal Trade Commission very hard to shut down Herbalife. They did a full-blown investigation into it. They did not shut it down. They did not say it was a Ponzi scheme. Yes, it's a multi-level marketing company. That's fine. There's a lot of great multi-level marketing companies out there that are not Ponzi schemes. And there have been some in the past that are. So anyways, it's got a little bit of a controversial reputation. Certainly never afraid to get in front of a camera and say what he's thinking about individual stocks, sectors of the market, or the market overall. But I just felt that this had created potentially a little bit of capitulation to the downside. Credit markets were also very jittery at the time. And then you had a little bit of recovery on Thursday, but then you had selling on Friday. And then on Monday, the market sold off again, actually closed below the Ackman lows on Monday, both the Dow and the S&P. But it's very typical sometimes for a market to test a previous low, close a little bit below it. Maybe there's a lot of traders or even some investors out there that say, okay, if we break that low, I'm getting out. So we go below that low, we close below that low, not by a tremendous amount, but rather than setting off a cascading action that goes on for weeks of additional selling, it almost creates like a capitulation reaction low a little bit below that level, after which we rally. And that lower low kind of becomes like new support for the market. That's why I look at what went on in the market in the third week of March and into March 23rd, which was a Monday, as the whole kind of, that's when the market put in its lows. It could test them again later. I'm starting to doubt that more and more.
Yeah, you're not alone on that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Although I will tell you that the majority of people, the majority of the market pundits that I saw on TV very, very early today feel that the downside has not been reached yet, that the economy will have a very, very, very difficult time coming out of this, and that when the economic numbers come out for the second quarter, investors will then go into another wave of selling and take the market down to a lower level. I disagree with that. I think that by the time that data
But you
comes
wouldn't be
out,
surprised. But you wouldn't be surprised, though, right? Because
could happen.
you know, and we before we pop, but I had you pop in before you know I went off on that little rant. I was saying, you know, that markets recover. I was never worried about the markets. You know, it's the real economy that I was always worried about. But
Right.
if we do see some of these, you know, and I think we will, you know, you would not be surprised if we saw, let's say, that 701 gets revised to 1.5 million, and then there's another big number on top of that with the jobs report at the end of next, you know, for the month of April. And we're going to see in 2 days, we're going to see some pretty ugly jobless claim numbers. What I'm guessing at though, you're saying is that you're leaning more toward some of this is baked in already, or a lot of it is baked in already. And you while you wouldn't be surprised, it just that you think traders they already have that factored in.
I think so. I mean, look, the stock market always has been the single greatest predictive tool that we have.
That's right.
And you have to realize that there are many points in time when you have to look at the stock market and the economy are two completely different dynamics. Okay.
Right.
A great
right.
example would be late in the fourth quarter of 2018, when the market began to sell off in early October. There were really kind of two events that sparked it. Primarily, Chairman Powell at the time, after a number of Fed hikes, gave a speech saying that interest rates we had hiked rates a number of times coming off zero, which we'd been at for many years and way too long, frankly, saying that interest rates were a long way from normal. Okay. So at the time, I think rates were like 2 to 2.25 in terms of the Fed funds rate. And then the message that the market took from that was that the Fed is going to keep hiking rates at least until they get to 3.25%, 3.5%. That'll be the middle of 2019. At the time, they were also unwinding a lot of their balance sheet, which had been built up through 6 years of QE. And the tightening through unwinding the balance sheet, in addition to the rate hikes and the expectation of 3 or 4 more rate hikes into the middle of 2019, was very constrictive on the market. We started to sell off. And a few days later, I believe that Vice President Pence gave a speech talking about, it was almost like a Cold War 2.0 type speech, talking about China and how, China has really, not been a friend of the U.S. on trade, eating our lunch for the last 2 decades, doing some egregious military expansion in the South China Sea, et cetera, et cetera. So the market's
told Powell we're not ready yet.
Off, and then sold off just ridiculously hard in December, going into the end of the year. We had a little bit of an inverted yield curve situation, and everybody was talking about recession.
Yes, let's talk. Which sent
everybody
the
was talking
into
about
the recession talk, right? And that and it, by the way, it inverted when. Let me point this out. When the yield curve indicates a recession, or in the past, when a yield curve has indicated a recession, it has not inverted for 24 hours or whatever it was at the time, Tim, right? Like it was like we were talking about a very quick movement, and then
inverted for a few days.
It was,
maybe the better part of a week.
Right. All right. I'll give you that. Okay. But we're not talking about a short-term inversion. No. And then when it returns, it widens out, that's just not at that time, by the way. That's the time that I told that I said, we're going to, from this point on, all the indicators we put on PPD are getting gray shaded areas for prior recessions, because I remember that. That's the time I said that. I said, you know what? whether it's unemployment claims, housing prices, whatever it may be. If it's an economic indicator and it has a chart, it is getting gray recession areas to indicate periods of recession. You know, before we get out of the business segment, though, Tim, yesterday at the press conference, we had this reporter ask a question about Wells Fargo. All right, what she did, and this is my issue I'm taking here, is she tied Wells Fargo halting the applications that they're taking for the PPA loans, the small business loans. She tied that with some of the hiccups we saw on Friday, which you and I talked about too.
Yeah.
And you know, we didn't. Nobody said this program, such a huge government liquidity program, was going to be perfect. But she tied those issues, most of which Mnuchin has addressed, and that's important to note. He made good on, you know, that on Friday afternoon when we contacted Treasury, they were well aware of the smaller bank issues. They were well aware of Bank of America, and they acknowledged it, and they said, we're going to fix this. The first 3 banks on Monday morning yesterday, after the show was done, they were taking applications. So he, you know, I mean, and then obviously there was more, but the point I'm trying to make is it was a very clear indication he addressed some of these issues. She tied Wells Fargo's particular situation with the problem with the problems that had, you know, been exposed during the rollout of the PPA. Explain why Wells Fargo could not take any more applications, because it wasn't, you know, had nothing to do with the PPA having issues.
So I don't have the exact specifics of it, but I know that, look, Wells Fargo had a big issue going back about 3 or 4 years ago, where they were incentivizing their reps primarily in their Wells Fargo Financial Services unit, which was like, let's say it's Wells Fargo brokerage. And a lot of the account coverage people in that part of their organization were different than people that might be handling just personal accounts, personal banking accounts, and or small business banking accounts. So basically what some very significant branch managers and probably even regional managers at Wells Fargo were doing would be that we're having their sales reps open new accounts for people without those people letting them know about it. And the reason they were doing it is because there was like a point system that salespeople and branch managers and regional managers were getting for, and you got certain points for if you signed up a new customer and he added a checking account, and he added a money market fund account, and he added a small personal loan account, and he added a savings account, and et cetera, et cetera. You got certain points for every additional account you opened. So some branch managers were, and salespeople were opening accounts for people and not letting them know about it.
And that's not, by the way, incentives, because I used to work in the industry. Incentives are not uncommon, you know, to give, you know, right, whatever it is, a broker, whatever.
Because you wanted your customer at Wells Fargo to not just have a checking account there, but to also have a brokerage account there, and also have a savings account there, and also have a money fund account there, and also have a Wells Fargo credit card,
but
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
To fake them, I couldn't even imagine faking.
I mean, the incentives were high. So these people were, look, I don't know how it began or how much up the line it basically went, but it basically cost the guy who was the CEO the job for whether or not he was not involved in it. The oversight into that area was nowhere near as compliant as it should have been. And a number of big regional sales managers lost their jobs. I don't know if anyone went to jail, but so they had all sorts of limitations put on them on business going forward. I don't think so.
We covered that story.
Right. So they had a lot of regulatory things slapped on them in the aftermath of that. One of which they could not do small business loans in an amount of X. And what Wells Fargo basically said was, well, we're up to our cap, given the regulations that we're under, without really, of course, they don't want to really say, you know, Not that they want to shine a spotlight on it, but they said, well, we're up to our cap. If the regulators would relieve us from that cap, we could do a lot more business.
But, to circle back to the reporter, nice try, by the way. Like
I
we talked about yesterday.
I think she was probably uninformed.
That's
she
my
probably
point.
took snippets of Wells Fargo's statement, because I don't think she's very bright to begin with.
Tim, how do
so
you
I don't think she was trying to twist the information. I just don't think she knew what Wells Fargo's statement was referring to.
And I don't think a lot of people realize that's probably the case. I'm just saying, from my experience with the press corps, they're lazy now. You'd be so shocked, guys, how lazy these people are. They think that they could substitute actual real journalism and research with their Twitter feed, their notifications on their Twitter feed. I mean, the laziness is unbelievable. Unbelievable. It's a little bit better in my experience. It's a little bit better on the business reporting side. I always found, money journalists to be, outright nicer people, and certainly smarter than political reporters. Political reporters now, they're also lazy. And which, by the way, she's a press corps, so she's not, CNN Money or CNBC, But the fact of the matter, if you're going to ask a question like that, don't you think it's incumbent on you to do the research to make sure you know what you're talking about? Like the guy on Friday, I think it was Friday, maybe it was Saturday, and we didn't have the show over the weekend, so I was remembering it. You don't know how supply and demand, Trump's face, you don't know how supply and demand works, do you? I mean, the guy had it completely backwards. These are lazy people. And, people should know that, because a lot of these things, I see a lot of comments on Twitter, and they'll say, these people are just out to get Trump. That's, of course, true, but that's not all that there is to it. She may have actually thought, folks, that she was smart, and she got him. They're that lazy. It's unbelievable. It's really, I don't ever overestimate their intelligence. Don't give them too much credit, because the fact of the matter is, you'd be making a mistake. So let me do the up the hour on the hour thing here. And then while Tim's given the on the hour market update, I'll look at questions. I did see before, we'll talk about that Cuomo being what the polling with Biden had Cuomo run, or what people have to say about that. We'll talk about that a little bit too. I did the poll. We went briefly over a poll, Tim, about how people feel about the stimulus and whether or not another round would even matter. And then, what their concern is about the government money. And I was going to share my screen, but I don't want to give away Rasmussen's internal stuff, but so maybe I'll just pop a few out without, and it's their model, so I don't want to throw it up there. So we'll go over that. And while Tim is giving the market update, I will look, because I do see a couple of messages, and we'll see what you guys are asking, and I'll do my best to answer them as always. So, okay. So again, 10:58 here, Tuesday, episode 3. If you want to support Inside the Numbers, we're not doing a Patreon, anything like that. Just subscribe to PPD. That's how you can support it. And it'll stream on PPD every day. And eventually Monday through Thursday, it will just be on PPD. But for now, we're just putting it out there. And then Fridays will be Friday freebies. Now, as of today, we were just on YouTube. I did Facebook Live, the rest of them, but and Periscope and whatnot. I didn't alert anybody, but I'll do that tomorrow, because I did see this guy is like, why didn't you tell anybody? I'll tell you tomorrow. All right. I'll tell you why. Because I got 3 kids, and they're home from school. And while I'm on my way out of the door, they're daddy. So that's just how it works, when you're an old man. So, so if you want to subscribe to the show, go to ppdnews.us/subscribe. And you can, if you just want to watch a show while it's streamed, you can get credits for that particular show. It's like $1 a credit or something. And then there's monthlies, annuals, and you can choose which one best fits your needs. So anyway, before I give this to Tim, I just want to say who is and who is not responsible for what is an essential service. Dry cleaners are an essential service. If you got to keep I just spilled this morning coffee everywhere. It just missed me. Thank God. It just missed me personally, but went all over the desk. I'm gonna have to clean the desk carpet. But I'll have to clean it up better. But I was thinking that the other day, on my way to work, on my way to the office, I passed the dry cleaners. And I also passed the guy that, my barber, right? Everything's of course closed down. The dry cleaners were open for a while.
Your dry cleaners, my dry cleaners here are open.
They're closed.
I'm in Jersey City, just outside of New York City.
I know.
So we've been in pretty good lockdown for a couple of weeks now. That dry cleaners is open.
The
laundromat across the street is open also.
You no doubt have a bigger professional class than we do. When the mayor, the city mayor, and the county commissioner paired up together to issue a stay-at-home order over here for us, they carved out. I mean, you got. What
about local
I'm
laundromats?
Carved out.
Local laundromats have to be open.
That's a good question. I don't know. I will tell you in Ocala, which is about 45 minutes, 50 minutes away. Laundromats are open, but internal laundromats. So like if you live in a subdivision or an apartment complex that has their own laundromat, those are closed because you can't social distance in most of those areas. It's just weird, Tim. I mean, some of the services that have been carved out in this stay-at-home order before the governor, because Ron DeSantis eventually did issue a statewide stay-at-home order. When he refused to the first time, my city issued their own, and they carved out the most ridiculous things. You could tell it was like everybody's friends at the meeting, on a conference call, whatever. And, they talked to the mayor and the county commissioner, and they said, I don't want to be, I need an exemption. I mean, some of them are just ridiculous.
Right, of course.
Yeah. And anybody who's like, media, who does a radio show, whatever it may be, they're exempt. So we can come in, but it's different the way it is here anyway. It's almost like natural social distancing here. Everybody's separated in their own area, so it's not difficult. Right. But the dry cleaners were open, and after they issued that stay at home, I would have to check, but I believe it wasn't their specific industry. It was that they were unable to to practice social distancing safely. I guess in their own area, maybe.
I don't know. The business might have fallen off a lot also.
It was. I mean, there's no doubt it must have been. I don't know. I mean, I didn't talk to the owners, but I could tell just by driving by. Usually there's a steady in and out. That strip mall is bare right now. It's sad to go. The only thing that's open over there is there's a Fresh Market and there's a Five Guys and Fries. And they're doing curbside Five Guys and Fries. So you order, you have the app, you call them whatever, and you pay for it, and they'll walk out. If you do it on the app, they'll walk right out to your car and hand you the bag with gloves on. Sal Laura, by the way, serves. So she serves the kids. That's how she does it. They have like cars. There's a line, and with gloves and a mask, and they hand it, and people walk on. But it just goes to show you when the government issues these orders, these arbitrary decisions about who is and who is not an essential service. And some of them, I mean, you guys, you should go and read some of these orders. They're just ludicrous. That's like somebody's brother-in-law had that business. And, he called up and he was like, I'm going to have my sister give you a hard time if you don't carve me out an exemption. Just ridiculous. But all right, I'm going to go read questions. Go ahead, Tim. You want to give a market update and I'll be back?
The market's given up a little bit more of its gains. The Dow's up 1.4%. The S&P is up 1.1, 1.2%. We were up as much as 3% right out of the chute. So I would say we've given up a half to 2/3 of the gains that we had during the first half hour. And I think that as long as we don't turn into like a sharp move to the downside today, if we can hold on to 3/4 of yesterday's gains, I think that investors will feel that that's a constructive move. It would be maybe better a little bit to end up positive on the day for most of the market averages, but we are going to hit some levels of resistance in the Dow, the S&P, the NASDAQ at 8,200. I think is maybe be a first level that will cause some real resistance on the upside. The other thing that I think is constructive is that the bond yields are a little bit higher, meaning that if The 10-year yields 0.75%. It had gotten as low as 0.6% at the end of last week. I would like to see that 10-year yield get a little bit closer to the 1% level. I just think it's very unhealthy for the market for that to be as low as it was right when all this chaos started before the Fed got real aggressive. I'm just talking about bond yields for a second here, but yields are a little bit higher today. I actually think that's constructive. And one thing that is very interesting, and we didn't quite get to it, but we were talking about how the yield curve can invert from time to time, and that was a case in the Q4 of 2018. It's very intriguing to me that throughout all of this chaos, the yield curve has not been inverted.
Right.
And if you look at the yield curve today, from the 1-month bills,
great point,
all the way through the 30-year bond, the yield curve has a very nice upward slope to it. Now, there's no doubt that we are probably in what would typically be a recession right now. Technically, just to be clear, the accurate academic definition of a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP. But I think that most people will tell you, look, we're in uncharted territory on a lot of metrics. We're in almost a self-induced economic recession right now,
which would be true.
From businesses being shut down to with the ultimate greater mission being to stop this virus from really taking over every facet of life in the country. So it's obviously unprecedented. We've never dealt with anything like this before. Unemployment's probably, in the 10 to 12% range, could go a little bit higher, depending on what claims will be the next couple of weeks. But I would think that it's intriguing, and I haven't heard too many people comment on it, that the yield curve has not gone inverted.
No, that was actually, you mentioning that was the first. I haven't looked at it, and but that would be supportive of Larry Kudlow's argument, which is that this is a historic first. Another one, harkening back to Friday's show. Another one for Donald Trump. The guy is he's a historical first figure. I mean, there's so many of them under his tenure. If you're a nerd like me and you like historical first with data, it's it's an interesting time. But that is the first time I've heard about that, and it does support Larry Kudlow's assessment, his argument that the fundamentals of the economy were sound still. There was a lot of talk about a slowdown before this happened. And Tim and I were always, I don't think, gathering from talking to you, I was still bullish as well. I thought there was a lot of potential there still. There's always a potential, of course, for a slowdown. I just didn't see enough. Again, this is why we put up those shaded areas. And if you follow and you read PPD, and we've covered the entire economic calendar, you would know that the overwhelming number of indicators did not point to a slowdown, but not the textbook definition of what Tim just cited as a recession. And there are different definitions that people use now. So a slowdown in its very raw form, meaning it's not 3% growth anymore annually. Maybe it's 2.2 or something like that. That some people now would like to lump into that definition of an economic downturn, a slowdown, but that's not the textbook definition. And we would not record a period like that as an economic recession. We wouldn't. It wouldn't go down in the history books like that. So we don't use it. I'll tell you what, the questions are always great here. And guys, if you do have them, I'm not looking at Periscope. I did see that one complaint on Twitter. I'll just look at my Twitter feed. There's like so many different ones to look at. I'll be honest with you guys who's watching. If you want to ask something, I favor the Twitter feed. I don't even look at Periscope. I made a last minute decision to add it to Periscope today. I've heard basically, nothing but complaints, but I did decide to do it to make it easier for some people. But great questions as usual. The first one here, I can answer much quicker, so I'll do that one first. And then the most asked question was about the Florida polling. The last 2 polls in Florida showing Biden up by 6. That was the most frequent one. But I'm going to answer first about the Wisconsin primary, which is, what happened and why is it on today, right? So I think Governor Walker, former Governor Scott Walker, said this best last night and has been saying this for now days. This was really, once again, another failure by not all of the failures are coming from Democratic governors, but a lot of them are. This is once again another failure by the Democratic governor, and he put the Wisconsin Supreme Court in a position where they really didn't have a choice. All right? Because there's a crisis, we cannot set horrible legal precedent. You cannot abandon codified law and constitutions and social contracts because you're in a time of crisis. And that's why James Madison said that crisis is the rallying cry of the tyrant, because this is the time everybody tries to do things like this. Just weeks ago, Tony Evers said he admitted he did not have the power to unilaterally postpone this election. He admitted that himself. And then he's issued this order as a last resort because he failed to do what a governor should do, yet another role of a governor. The Republican legislature didn't favor it. They hadn't favored it. As a matter of fact, in March, he didn't favor it. The Democratic governor, Evers, didn't favor it. And so Republicans just kind of stayed consistent on that. While, and this is only, by the way, it obviously has only to do with in person. So the arguments were, why don't we just end in-person voting and, do another system only, in mail system only, or, whatever. It would be much easier in a state like Florida, by the way, to do that. We have a lot of mail and absentee voting. But anyway, he never called the Republican legislature, and he never worked with them. There's a lot of this going on now too, folks. And this is a great example of what the product of it is. The partisanship is such that a lot of people aren't talking anymore. Your leaders aren't talking to each other anymore. This was something that really started under Barack Obama and then became very, very bad under Donald Trump. Barack Obama never called. After a while, he basically ceased all phone calls to the House of Representatives. They didn't talk. He even barely spoke to Harry Reid when Harry Reid was still the Senate leader. But now that looks like they were bosom buddies compared to what we got today. And it was the job of the governor to make sure that he got with the legislature to hatch out a deal to prevent this situation. So now they left the voters in Wisconsin with a choice between not voting, not exercising your right to vote, and putting your health at risk. It's a crummy choice, but the Wisconsin Supreme Court made the right decision. He does not have the authority to do that. And simply because we're in a time of crisis, you cannot grant single executives vast powers that the legislature did not give them. You cannot undo or rewrite a constitution because, especially because a governor didn't do their job. That's not the way this country works. I mean, other countries work like that. That's why we have the rule of law, in theory anyway. Those are one of our cherished principles. And it's a whole other show. But the rule of law, property rights. I mean, these are the foundations of a free society, and you can't just undo that because the governor failed to do his job. So the Wisconsin Supreme Court, they really had no choice. It was a 4-2 decision for conservatives, 2 liberals. And a second element to that question, which somebody gave today, you saw the endorsement on Twitter, probably if you follow Donald Trump's account. He did endorse the conservative candidate for the Supreme Court justice. And in truth, this is another reason why I would say Democrats are mad about this decision, because Republicans, they feel, we'll have to see tonight when the results come in,
whether or not this argument is even founded. But Republicans feel that Democrats feel that this gives Republicans the advantage in that Supreme Court race today. We won't know that until the votes come in. Conventional wisdom says that, Republicans tend to vote more or are more reliable. But at the same time, in Wisconsin, Republican voters are older voters. They're also the ones who are more exposed to, they are at higher risk if they were to contract the coronavirus. So the argument could be made too for the Republicans can make a similar argument that this virus is particularly deadly to their demographic group of voters, reliable demographic group of voters. So, again, that's why I said, and I stressed, wait until the results roll in, because the rest is just really speculation. But anyway, the point is, the greater point to the initial question is that the Wisconsin Supreme Court really had no choice. Party line vote 4-2. And then the second one, Tim, is on Florida polling. There have been 2 polls over the last this week, right? I guess they were collected, probably some of them over the weekend. And Trump trailed Biden by 6 in both of these polls. I don't like to get into the business of criticizing other pollsters. It's hard. It's not an exact science. It's very easy to be wrong. But I will say this. We've gone over this before. I think it was Friday. And I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about modeling in Florida. And then we sneak peek into the voter files yesterday, and we showed you why Republicans have been able to hang on to very close statewide races in this state. It is going to be very difficult to defeat Donald Trump in the state of Florida. That includes whether or not he loses the presidency, he loses his reelection. The bottom line is here, Republicans, as I showed you with the modeling, Republicans vote at much higher rates. If you do take a look at those polls, and again, I'm not going to criticize pollsters by name. I'm just not going to do that here, Tim, unless they really deserve. Unless I feel like somebody's really up to something, like there are, and there are pollsters out there who I flatly don't like. I know what they're doing, and you did not pull a voter file that was 10,000, 15,000 records, and you did not do that and then get 150 responses on a landline 18 to 29 years old. You're full of crap. And I'll call stuff out like that when I see it, but I don't want to get in the business of just criticizing people because they came out with results that other people don't like. I will say this. Nobody wins Florida by 6 points. And we talked about minimum standard requirements for sample size at big data poll and why we do that, especially important in states like Florida. And if you look at that breakdown, in those polls, when independents, it's what we talked about the other day. When independents do make shifts in the state, they make small corrections. They don't make huge corrections. If it was me, I would have liked to see mixed mode sampling, which when I say that, I'm talking about maybe this much on landlines, this much on cell phones, this much on an online panel. Florida is so diverse. People respond to different data collection modes at different rates. And if you're wrong on a hair of something, you're going to be wrong across the board. And we typically do see advantages for Democrats in Florida, in early Florida polling. We have that is almost a trend. After 2018, I basically said, can you all please stop polling my state? This is getting so embarrassing. I mean, the Gillum plus 13 out of CNN. And then like a week after the election, they put out a PDF nobody has ever seen. It's not on their report. It's maybe mentioned in like the blog section really quick. The race tightened, but for 9 days before the election, they're giving Gillum a 13-point lead. Tim could tell you guys. And I was talking before that election to Jerry Willis. She was covering the Florida governor's race. So I was sending her, we were tracking the governor and Senate races. And I was sending her the data. And I was trying to stress, and we had talked about this, and Tim and I had talked about this. it was a 4-point margin about 5 days before the election for Andrew Gillum with a lot of undecided independents. And I was feeling, and right, Tim, I was feeling nervous about that. I said, this margin's too big. Something's wrong somewhere. I have to find this. And I was concerned because those Florida people don't win Florida by big margins, not unless they're exceptions. And Marco Rubio was an incumbent senator. It was actually, with the exception of what had happened with him and Trump in the primary, he has a broad coalition. So, runs it up in DeSoto for a Republican, does very well. So he wins the state by like 4 points. But I knew it would be a very close governor's race. And I was worried that I had Gillum's lead was just too much. And then over the course of 2 or 3 days, right before the election, the weekend heading into the election, that race tightened significantly. And DeSantis overtook him by 1 point on Monday. And that came from a bunch of independents. And you remember this, Tim, a bunch of independents in Pinellas County and other places that he was doing not well in for a Republican, especially compared to Donald Trump's numbers. And they just decided that, one, Andrew Gillum had too many question marks. He just had too many question marks. There was the corruption questions. He just was, and then two was he was too far to the left. I mean, when we asked people whether or not they would vote for a governor who held his particular positions, not his name, but if a gubernatorial candidate supported such and such policy on healthcare, if a gubernatorial candidate supported such and such policy on immigration, would you vote for that candidate? This is always a major failing.
But there was one issue too that really killed him, with a subsector of voters that he should have dominated. School choice.
Oh, yeah. And give it to the Wall Street Journal. They did do a good autopsy on that issue, Tim. They did. School choice.
You had that nailed the following.
We did. I said, wow, is it? And then, by the way, that was one of the other things that I was concerned about. I'm like, this is too much support among black voters. This can't be right. My head was everywhere, and it turned out we were, but my head was everywhere. And the point I'm trying to make is the first initial thing that alarmed me was that anything 4 points or more in Florida is something's wrong. Right. And in the case of DeSantis and Gillum, they were still both in the low to mid 40s. So there was room there. So looking back on it, I was saying to myself, well, I guess this could, we're talking about statistics here. I mean, we have sampling errors. So, it was reasonable looking back. But between the margin and Ron DeSantis's support among black voters, particularly black women, which that did bear out, Tim, that happened. But I didn't think it was. I didn't think it was right, if you remember, because they are the most Democratic voting group. Right. So I thought something was wrong, and we were getting like 16, 18, some days 22, and I'm like, this can't be right. But it was. It turned out to be roughly right on the money. And then also he did much better among Hispanics in the I-4 corridor, which we spoke about the other day. And sometimes, these earlier polls in Florida, they're not screening tightly at all. And like I showed you the other day on the voter file, and maybe when we do the quick break, I'll pop it back up to remind everybody. Maybe I'll do that, Tim. I'll pull the voter file in Florida back up. But just to, if you weren't watching Monday, and I'll show you this again, but a lot of these pollsters aren't screening tightly at all right now. Their likely voter models are either nil or very loose. And if you were to just open up the voter file in Florida, Democrats have about a 2-point advantage. And you'll see a lot of these polls. Again, folks, the term is overrepresented, not oversampled. I'm going to beat that like a dead horse, but Republicans have the edge in actual voting. And when we do the likely voter models, that turns into usually anywhere from a D1, I mean, you know, a D1 to an R3, but it favors the Republican Party because there are just some areas like, look at, by the way, in 18, look at Collier and Collier County and Lee. I mean, these are not counties you hear about in the media, you know, and they don't talk about it. The vote out of there was just massive. It was massive. And that is what I'm showing you when I pull up these voter files and I show you the predictive modeling, which I'll do in a little bit. I'm going to do the little break, the little spiel early here, and then maybe you can give us the market update because I haven't looked at it, but I did just see that message from DRY211, whatever his handle is. And is it down, or is he just misreading something?
No, the markets are still up.
It's still up. He must be just referring. We're giving away some gains. It couldn't be down all that much. You know, we gave up some gains. All right. Well, let me go through the spiel and then send me more questions, because when Tim's doing the market update, I'll read them like I just did before. And I hope that answers it. But I'll also go back. I'll pop open the voter file again, and we'll take a look at this. I will show you the raw, just the totality. If you just cast a very large net in Florida, you do not screen at all. I'll show you the difference between them again, because Florida polling's on the top of the list today. So people who are asking questions. So let me go through this, and then I'll hand you off to Tim, and we'll go through it, and I'll be back. So anyway, 11:26. So we're streaming out live everywhere again, guys. Fridays is the way this is going to be from the jump. But if you want to support the show, just subscribe. You can subscribe to PPD. That's the way to support the show. ppdnews.us/subscribe. All right. So I'll be back. Tim, go ahead. Take it away. Give us that market update. I'm going to read some more questions.
So it looks like we're on a good track for a second positive day today. The market's holding on to about half of the gains that it had right out of the chute. We're a little bit higher than we were 30 minutes ago. The Dow is up 2%. The S&P is up about 1.6%. NASDAQ up a little bit less than that, but still above the 7,900 level. The NASDAQ has had maybe a little bit better bounce off the lows than a couple of the other, than the Dow or the S&P. I'm also watching oil pretty closely today. There was a report on Reuters early this morning that there is a tentative agreement between the Saudis and the Russians on a oil production cutback, maybe somewhere in the range of 10 to 15%. Now, oil is not up that much today. It had a very strong move at the end of last week, so it's trading around 26.5. That would be, and it had traded maybe as just over $27 earlier this morning. I think it would be that allegedly they're going to have a meeting or a announcement on Thursday about whether or not this production cut is whether or not they really have an agreement on it. So
all right, that was a good take on oil, actually, and that was actually one of the questions. You said something yesterday, and I got numerous comments from it. You gave two scenarios. You know, what Trump might have said to the Russians and what Trump might have said to the Saudis. And people gave me just good feedback on that. They were like, that was great. But I guess oil is, we got an intelligent audience. You know, I mean, really, oil is a high interest thing right now, Tim. So I just figured I'd let you know that. But while I'm back, I did, while you were doing that, I did tell people I'd show them what I was just talking about. So for people who did not watch yesterday, I'm going to show them, and I'll probably have to zoom in here, but I'll show them again. This is the difference between and why likely voter models matter so much. I'm going to show you the difference between just casting a very wide net in Florida. So if you're a pollster and you're trying to figure out who, what is a representative model of a projection of the electorate, I'm going to show you how easy it is to make a mistake and why I keep arguing and explaining to people how Republicans hold on to these statewide seats. And regardless of what the early polling especially might say. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share this, pop us back over here. Let me just give them the, oh, you can see pretty well. So I'll keep us up here. But so here's Florida. The only thing I'm excluding here are dead people and people who have recently changed their address. So there's a flag for recent address changes. They shouldn't be voting. So, whether or not they will or not, I'm leaving that for somebody else's show. All right. I'm not getting into that, but this is the standard and correct thing to do. You're not going to put in movers there. All right. All right. So here, run the count. It's going to give you, like it did yesterday, it'll give me a number for how many unique individuals. And then I'm going to run the modeling and it will go through the database and it will find out, what share is Republican, what share is Democrat, what share is third party, and what share is unaffiliated, which we have a growing and large number of in this state. So about 13 million, a little over 13 million, about 2,500 over. Run it. I'm going to keep party, gender, household income, marital status, inferred ethnicity. The inferals, folks, they are very accurate. All right. I think I can get it. That's a whole other segment, but let's run it. And let me show you why in Florida you will see these, D plus whatever polls. So it tells you how many landline records it located, how many mobiles, how many emails, and it gives you back. It's a little bit different, but it's roughly the same. For those of you who watched yesterday, you see it's roughly the same as it was the other day. These things are fluid, and you would want your data to be fluid. And that is also why we don't wait for party identification over here. If you wait for party identification, all right, let me put it this a different way. Show me an election where the preceding electorate composition mirrored the one that came after. So show me which election cycle in which you can say 2 years ago or 4 years ago, the electorate looked exactly like it did the prior cycle. You won't be able to find one. And my point being is that if you wait for party, depending on what you think the electorate's going to look like, or what, based on whatever your gut is, or then you will be wrong. It's that simple. And we saw a lot of that in 2016. Waiting for party, when in 2012 with Mitt Romney, Republicans argued the opposite, and they were wrong, by the way. Mitt Romney was never going to win that election. That was not going to happen. But they were arguing that Republicans were underrepresented represented in those polls, and they were not. And I would again say it's not impossible for Democrats to have a bigger advantage in Florida than we've seen in the last couple of cycles. But we saw that with Obama, but that is very common to see a party come out and defend their president, their incumbent president, in droves. And Rick Scott, Ron DeSantis, they made that their elections almost proxy elections. And they knew that Donald Trump among Republicans in Florida was very popular. And it was the smart move. So anyway, I'm going on and on, but I'm sure you're looking at it. So about 37% for Democrats and about 35, just under 35 for Republicans. This is the totality of the electorate. All right. Gender, almost identical to yesterday, Tim, almost identical. So Florida is the female voters. I think the average nationally is 52.5 female, but Florida is slightly more female, and the electorate that actually goes out and votes, that same is true. It's just that Republicans do better down here with women than they do in other areas of the country, so they make that up. And we have this broken down by in 5,000 increments of what people make, all right? And household marital status, whatever. But for now, I just want you to focus on this party number because I'm trying to show you in the raw, Democrats have a slight 2% edge, roughly 2% edge. Let's go and say, for instance, voting propensity score. Okay. We want to know, we're talking about these two polls. So it's a general election, these polls. And we want to know what is the likelihood of these voters to come out and vote. The higher the propensity score in Florida, the higher
the larger the advantage will grow for the Republican. Let's just do 50-50 like I did yesterday. And the reason why is because when we poll, we say, how likely are you to vote? And we'll say certain. You are certain to vote, meaning there is a 100% chance that you are going to vote, either by whatever absentee ballot, whatever we ask them. And then very likely means that the odds are greater than 50-50 that you are going to vote. This is how it's worded. So that's why I'm showing you this particular value. And then not likely is less than 50-50. Not at all likely, less than 25, however we want to do it. It's not always the same, although the 50-50 breaks are always there. And then certain not to vote means there is 0% chance. And people do lie, which is why it's great to have these voter files, Tim, because we can go back and cross the record with the respondent. And we can see whether, like I said, I used the example of Dolores the other day. We can see whether Dolores is lying to us. Dolores, I'm not voting this election. And then I go back and I look, and Dolores has voted in every single election since she was 18 years old. She's going to vote again, And then on the flip side, like you pointed out, a lot of time younger voters will say they are going to vote, or they are likely or certain to vote. And we'll see that they skipped the last 2 or 3 elections. So that is a pollster's call. And it depends on how they put together their likely voter model. So I'm explaining this all to you because I want you to understand what goes into it. But I'm sure there are people saying, just shut up and run the thing, Rich, so we can see. So let's run it. Let's update it. All right. It's going to give us another count. It ran a certain, of about 4 million records. Let's pull it up again. I'm keeping all the variables the same as they were before. We're going to refresh it. And remember, it was a little over D+2. Now look where we're at. Republicans are now at 46% almost. Democrats barely budged. Okay. I really can't stress this enough, Tim. All right. They barely budged. Republicans were at 35%, and they rose when we added the voter propensity scores. They rose from 35% to 46%. Now, I want to make sure everybody understands that does not mean the electorate's going to be 46% Republican. That's why those other increments are important as well, while we do change the wording of those questions, because essentially we score them and we look at their vote history, and then we decide whether or not that they're telling the truth, or whether they're going. We tend to favor, at least outside of Dolores and little Mikey, we'll call the other example little Mikey, Tim. Okay. So outside of Dolores and little Mikey, for the most part, we tend to believe them as long as their vote history is convincing. And so maybe the true electorate will turn out to be R+1 or R3. I haven't taken the data from the other pollsters and reweighted anything for what I think. I'm doing this as an exercise to show you that the Republican advantage grows significantly. In fact, it grows so much that they can sustain a slight swing away from them in independents, like we saw in 2018. Independents nationally swung hard against Republicans from 2016. And there's an argument to be made that there are a lot of liberals in those independent samples. But the fact of the matter is they swung. In Florida, they did not show huge swings like that. They don't swing that much down here. And that is a product of I would argue that polls that show those swings, those are artifacts of the polls themselves and how those polls are conducted, or by which method or mode they're collecting responses, whatever it may be. There's a host of stuff that it could be. But the fact of the matter is, the greater the likelihood, the tighter the screen for the likely voter, the more advantage the Republican builds in Florida. And we've seen this over and over. Republicans didn't really like Mitt Romney, right, Tim? I mean, I don't know if Tim jumped away for areas. Republicans didn't really like Mitt Romney.
I muted my mic for a minute.
They nominated him.
Right.
But they didn't really like him.
Right.
And they certainly did not race out to the polls to support Mitt Romney. Not like we've seen with Donald Trump, not like we've seen with his initial election, with people who support him, because again, I would say especially Ron DeSantis, that was a proxy election. He fully embraced Donald Trump, and he basically took the best of both worlds. He embraced Donald Trump to ensure that he would get the Trump voter. And on the flip side of that, when we talked about the support he got from the Black community over school choice, is that he wisely incorporated Tip O'Neill's old former statement that all politics are local, is local. And that really does apply to gubernatorial elections. Probably if it applies to anything, it applies to gubernatorial races above all others. I mean, even the same is true of congressional seats, but it really does apply to gubernatorial elections. And you can see a gubernatorial candidate make moves that a presidential candidate would not make, and get support from areas that a presidential candidate would not get, because voters don't see them as having a direct impact on those areas on certain areas of their life, being public education, for instance. That is widely viewed as a local issue. So he was able to seize on that. And then he was also able to embrace Donald Trump and make sure he got that vote out, which is, and Rick Scott did as well. They're good friends. So, he had no problem doing that. But Rick Scott also didn't do, and this underscores what I was just saying before, Rick Scott didn't do as well among Black women that Ron DeSantis did. He did well across the board, given his older numbers, and he defeated a 3-term incumbent. But again, the whole point of this exercise, I can always get into the weeds. I'm a little bit nerdy like that. The whole point of this exercise is to show you that when the screens get tighter, when the likely voter screens get tighter, it is much, much more likely that the Republican advantage will grow. We are now in a cycle where there is a Republican incumbent president. In 2012, I think it was D+5 down here in 2012, Tim, something like that. I have to go back and look at the exit polls, but it was a Democrat advantage. Mitt Romney actually won independents, but lost them by, I think, 1. If I am correct. In Florida, I think he lost them by 1. But the electorate overall was D3 or D5, and that is not unexpected. It's not a surprise. It's actually really typical. You saw it in 2024 with George W. Bush running for re-election, where there was elements of his base that came out in droves. You will see that, and you will see that for Donald Trump.
By current standards, Bush 43 won re-election. His margin in Florida was quite high.
Well, very big margin. But he had his brother here. Very popular governor.
Yep.
Very popular governor.
Yes.
And then also, too, that was before what we saw was essentially a complete fall off of Democratic voter registration among whites above 45 years old. And that is no longer, even though the media will tell people this, that is no longer what's driving the trend. And the trend is negative for Democrats right now. So they have an advantage of 200,000 plus, but it is the slimmest advantage in the history of tracking voter statistics by partisan affiliation. The Secretary of State down here started that in 1972. And they now have the slimmest advantage. When George W. Bush ran, Tim, I believe by the time it was him against Kerry, it had narrowed to, I want to say about 500. If you go to PPD, it's all up there. But it narrowed to about, I want to say 500,000. But there was still a large segment of white Democrats who were voting for Republicans, at the federal level. That was happening. Now, a lot of them have essentially been purged. They switched their registration. They are either independents who vote Republican more often than not, though they can cross over, or they are just flatly Republicans. But
you had this subsector of the Democratic Party, particularly in the South and even in some southern some areas of the southern Midwest, that were blue dog Democrats. Now, though, they have been almost completely eliminated from Congress, and with those seats being taken over by Republicans. That probably was a 2010 phenomena.
And we're seeing that too, still, although to a lesser extent, in North Carolina. We've seen that as well. We've seen large, and when I say
those would have
large,
been your conservative Democrats.
that's right. I'm talking about 20-25%.
Right.
Maybe
so you don't
more.
get the crossover vote, but the reason you don't get the crossover vote is a lot of those Democrats have just said, I'm just not a Democrat anymore.
That's right.
They're either going to be an independent, or some of them are going to be a Republican.
But I want to make it clear that if you look at the monthly updates, that trend has in Florida, specifically Florida, that trend has largely exhausted itself, meaning white people, older whites, changing from the Democratic registration to Republicans. While it is still happening, that is not what's narrowing the advantage for Democrats here. There were 50-something thousand new voters registered in 2 months ago, which is the most complete picture we have. Okay. Yeah. And Republicans outpaced them by about 7 points, about 7%. And you and I have talked about this privately about what is doing that. There's new constituencies here. They heavily favor the Republican Party. And while we have Amendment 4, we've had similar amendments like that in other states, including red states or formerly red states that are now in play, like Arizona. But they are not in play because of Amendment 4 like legislation. They're in play because of migration and immigration. And I think you're going to see that. I think that debate will be over, Tim, when the census is done. I've been able to look at a lot of the newer census data, and even among groups like educated groups of Americans, it isn't that Republicans are losing ground with educated Americans in the suburbs. That is an overly simplified way of putting it. They are not the same group of people that they won in, like, for instance, 2010. They don't fit the same demographic profile. Foreign-born and new naturalized citizens with a college degree, including bachelor's degree and higher, outpace native-born Americans now. And while overall, since 2010, the census is going to report, and I can tell you this, the census will report that immigration is slowing in this country. All right. Maybe it doesn't feel like that to a lot of you, but that's what they're going to report. But the educated class of voters is changing. They don't look the same as they did in 2010. So it's not really accurate, nor is it honest to say that there's like a shift in voter preference. The truth is, we don't know that yet. I have been pitching this idea, by the way, to a couple of people. I would love to do a study to poll, Tim, just educated Americans, and go by generation and voter preference, and ask them about vote history, which some of it we can compare with the voter file, but some of it we can't. We need them to actually just report who they voted for. We can't go in and look at, who the people voted for, but that would make for a very interesting study, because I think we're going to find that there is no real big change in voter preference. The change is in who is now classified in that subgroup demographically as an educated American. And what people wondering what I'm doing over here, to illustrate my point even more, I have moved the value up to 80%. So now what this means is these are voters who are at least 80% likely to vote in an election, in the election we picked, which is general. All right. A general election. Let's see what it is, Tim. So we had a 37, 45 or 46 advantage for Republicans, right? So watch this. So now here we are, the counts run. All right. Or I could actually, let me go down a little bit more, because those are unique households. I got to widen it out a little bit. Let's do 70%. Okay. All right. And I should have included the other ones, but it'll spit it back out. It'll tell me exactly. It's going to be a much smaller sample, but it'll give you what, it knows. So this one actually, so it did move a little bit. So 45, that's because it's such a small sample. It's too small, but I might have hit something else too demographically here, but let's go to 60. make sure I'm right there above. Might have hit the relationship thing. Might have done it. But the point I'm trying to make is when you cast a wide net, Democrats' advantage is in because it's just a raw. But when you start to, get a tighter screen, for those who are just tuning in, I can see when you get a tighter screen, the Republican advantage builds. And now we see it a little bit more here, Tim. And that's a bigger sample. That's a bigger modeling sample than the other two choices I just tried, which makes me feel a little bit more comfortable with the results. If it's just like polling, if the predictive modeling is a small sample, you have to take that with a grain, kind of thing. This is a much larger sample here. We're talking about, 80,000 landline records, 61,000 email records, 85,000, mobile records, and 85,000 email records. So the point and now we're at 49% Republican. Again, it doesn't mean that the electorate would be 49% Republican. It's just to show you the advantage and who is more likely. And females, by the way, look, now we're at 54, 46. So it actually came down a little bit, which says in this particular bracket, men are more likely to vote. But, I think the point's made, and if these early polls, which tend to have a much wider screen, if these earlier polls are going to just cast a big net and registered voters, for instance, then this is why that at least in part, why you're going to see those earlier polls favor Democrats. And we have seen that in the last, go look in Florida polling in 2016. The Real Clear Politics average has a funny way of shifting, and not the final average doesn't give you an accurate picture of what the narrative was in the weeks and months leading up until, to these elections. So now it looks good, but go back and click that expand polling, expand table, show more polling, whatever it says. Go back and look at 2016. Go look at how Rick Scott wasn't leading in a single poll when he was running against Charlie Crist until the final couple weeks. Not a single poll. It's just blue for months. Almost a year and a half of hypothetical head-to-head polling. And while Trump did have a slight advantage in the final RCP average in 2016, that was not the case. And that was not the narrative building up until the election. That happened because of Ann Selzer polling for Bloomberg and a couple other ones out there. For the most part, the go-to media polls, Quinnipiac, what's some other ones? Monmouth, Tim, right?
Yep.
They all
Emerson.
had Hillary winning. They all had Hillary winning Florida. And by the way, he won it by 1.2%.
Right.
We had Trump +2, but that was because, and why we love to give decimals, that was because it was 1.5 or something, 1.5 or 1.6. So it rounded up to 2, unless you clicked on the actual state, which took you to the polling. And then you could see inside that by the decimal, it was 1.6.
Yeah,
so we
you were right
off
between
by
1.5 and 1.6.
Yeah, we were 0.4 of a percentage point off. 0.4. And that was after Rick Scott, which we basically got within a few thousand votes if you were to do the math by votes. But it's 11:53. Before we go, Tim, give everybody the last market update of the day, and I'll see real quick. Maybe I can get another question or two in before we end this out.
So the market's building on the gains. It's continues to grind a little bit higher. It's done very well over the last hour. We're 2.5 hours into the trading day. One level to watch is 2685 on the S&P 500. The S&P 500 right now is around 2725. Yeah, the S&P 500 is at 2725. If it can close at 2685 or higher, that will be a 20% rally off the lows from March 23. Now the Dow Jones started the day a little over 22% off the lows from March 23. That doesn't necessarily mean we're in a new bull market yet. We have had 20% rallies before, off and during long protracted bear markets, but this has not been a long protracted bear market. If we are in a bear market, this just started in really early March. So that's the one big unique factor about this market that really makes it difficult to go back and draw comparisons toward the big market sell-off after the internet bubble burst in the spring of 2000, or even the sell-off that went on after the 9/11 terrorist attack in September of 2011. So this sell-off's only been going on for 6 weeks. And if the S&P can close above 2685, that'll be a 20% lift off its lows.
That's good stuff. Good stuff. And we have 4 minutes here. I'm going to answer David's question real quick. Maybe we'll come back to this tomorrow because we have been focusing on Florida so much during those segments. Let's look at Wisconsin next. All right. So we'll do that tomorrow, David. And I'm going to answer it as briefly right now, which is that if you look at the Marquette poll, and I do like the Marquette poll, I think they do a decent job over there. The media, calls them the gold standard in Wisconsin. I wouldn't, I wouldn't go that far. I don't know if anybody's really a gold standard anymore. There are better polls than others, and Marquette is certainly a high quality poll. He asked if Wisconsin was trending Biden. And the reason why is because Trump was up before. He was up in the, I think the New York Times Siena poll. Bottom line is overall, we'll take a look at the voter files tomorrow. Overall, the state is trending Republican actually in party advantage alone. And they have a large sector of independents, which they really decide the election. In the Marquette poll, Trump actually, had independents. Where he fell short in that poll is among Republicans. So if past his prologue, that means, and what I mean by that, if history tells us anything, it's that the base will consolidate around Donald Trump. So going forward, and I'll explain this more, I'll show this a lot more in the voter files tomorrow. Going forward, watch the independent vote. There are a lot of former Democrats in the independent vote in these polls. And if he holds on to the independent vote, it'll win Wisconsin. It's that simple. Unless he does, for some reason, lose a large part of his base. Well, I really don't anticipate that. In the end, Wisconsin, which voted for Ted Cruz over Donald Trump in the primary, in the end, they came back and they rallied behind their guy. And that will happen, I'm a big lover of history. History definitely tells us a lot about what we can expect in the future with voting behavior. And I would fully expect Republicans, considering the shares he's getting in these primaries and his approval rating among Republicans, I would fully expect those Republicans to come back. That's why he was trailing in that poll, and also the representation of the electorate. So he was ahead in the last one. Now he's trailing by 3. And we'll take a bigger look at Wisconsin tomorrow, folks. All right. We're going to open that voter file up tomorrow. That's a good idea, David. And thank you for asking that question, because maybe I have Florida bias and I tend to overly focus on Florida. But let's open up some other battleground states, starting with Wisconsin. And then maybe we'll move more into the Midwest, Iowa and Ohio over the rest of the week. And that's a good idea. I just decided that's a good idea. We're doing that. All right. So with 2 minutes left to go, if you want to support the show, subscribe to PPD. It's ppdnews.us/subscribe. And until we come back here on Wednesday, folks, I am the People's Pundit. My Twitter handle is down there. You can follow me there, and follow TJ Anderson, Tim the Source Anderson, at TJ Anderson1, at TJ Anderson1. Anything you want to say for a minute, Tim, before we got 30 seconds left, 45 seconds?
Well, in terms of the market, I just think that if we're up, the Dow is up 600, 2.7%. The S&P is above 2,700. It would be significant to hold a chunk of these gains going into the close. We've had some volatile moves in the last hour, the last 90 minutes, the last couple of weeks. It's 4 hours away. A lot can happen, but I just feel good about the way the rally is broadening out today.
So that's good stuff. And tomorrow we will talk about what happened in the latter part of the day with trading, like we did this morning with yesterday. We'll fill you guys in. And again, with 15 seconds left here, tomorrow will be like we did today. I didn't announce it, but we'll be on Facebook Live, Periscope, YouTube. So, you choose, or you can see it on PBD. All right. So we'll see you guys back here tomorrow, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. All the best, folks.